Welcome to my channel, everybody. Hit the bell, subscribe, share and like. I'm doing a collab. What begins with C ends with W. What begins with C and ends with T. What begins with D and ends with G. What begins with T and ends with E. What begins with Y and ends with S. What begins with D and ends with R. What begins with P and ends with E. What begins with Y and ends with E. What begins with P and ends with E. What begins with C and ends with T. What begins with L and ends with E. What begins with S and ends with K. No, what begins with S and ends with Y. What begins with Y ends with U. What begins with kicking K and ends with S. What begins with R ends with N. What begins with L ends with O. No, what begins with L and it ends with E. What begins with S and ends with G. What begins with M and ends, what begins with M and nothing. No, what begins with C ends with D. What begins with R, what begins with O ends with T. What begins with C ends with S. What begins with N and ends with T. What begins with what begins with R and ends with what begins with R and ends with R. What begins with M. No, what begins with M. What begins with M. Then D. What begins with M, then D. What begins with C and with S. What begins with C and it ends with R. What begins with Y and ends with S. What begins with D ends with K. What begins with S and ends with W. What begins with C ends with E.